Hello, everyone. My name is Barkha, and welcome to NerdRx Podcast. And today we have a very interesting topic called high-throughput screening. And to talk more about it, we have one of my best friend, Dr. Shravan Morla. Welcome, Shravan, to the show.
Thank you, Barka. It's a pleasure. Thanks for inviting me.
Yes, of course. So let's get into the topic right away. Why don't you tell our listeners something about your background and how did you come to this point where you are now?
Sure. So I have a pharmacy degree from India. And in India, you can actually get a pharmacy degree during bachelor's. So I had a chance to work in a pharmacy lab and explore different areas of pharmacy in terms of medicinal chemistry, pharmaceutics, formulations. I spent each semester in a different setting, trying to understand what kind of projects that each lab does and what does that specialization mean. And I fell in love with medicinal chemistry,
Wow.
which is basically trying to design drugs using chemistry to design medicines. That is what medicinal chemistry is, right? And I decided to get a PhD in medicinal chemistry, and I joined Virginia Commonwealth University with you
Yes.
for my PhD. And during my PhD, I realized that medicinal chemistry also has different subtypes, right? You can be in a medicinal chemistry lab making compounds, or you can use computational tools to screen these compounds, or you can use biological tools to screen the compounds developed by chemists. And I tried my hands in all of these, and I realized that testing these drugs in a biological setting is what motivates me the most, is what my cup of tea is. And that's what I've been doing since. And that is what we're going to talk about today, high throughput screening. And right now, I am a high throughput screening scientist at a biotech called Generate Biomedicines, where we generate biomedicines and test them using our high throughput screening system, which I'm very excited to talk about.
That is amazing. And by the way, we both started our PhD together and ended our PhD together. And it was a fun ride.
It
Tough, but a
was.
fun one.
Yep, definitely a lot of memories, ups and
Yes.
downs, like everyone faces during their PhD program.
Uh-huh.
But it was worth it.
It was worth it. Like,
Mhm.
as I think I mentioned in my introductory episode, like, keep at it. And there, I think for me, it was more downs than ups. But in the end, like today, when I look back, I'm like, thank goodness I did not quit. So
That is right.
now I'm like, it has definitely for me, but I'm pretty sure for you as well, has like you have become a better scientist because of all the downs, especially.
Hmm. Everything's a teaching moment for sure,
Yes,
right? And
exactly.
for some of our friends, maybe stopping where they had to stop was probably a right decision. Uh, and just for the listeners, if you're going through this, especially during your PhD process, we don't have so much help. So there are people out there who you can talk to, seek help from, whether it's emotional, mental issues, or anything. I just wanted to let you know that we went through the same thing and we are here to help.
Yes, and let me also emphasize that nothing is more important than your mental health. So if you ever feel that you're drained, just take a break, talk to someone who is in your situation or a professional. And trust me, there are like a lot of people who are like ready to help because they have been through it.
That is right.
Like, I think I have realized through my PhD that we are scared maybe to talk about these stuff, especially like mental health issues. But once you talk to the right people, they are so welcoming, and so they are very helpful people out there.
Yep. We don't realize how common this is until we
Yes.
talk about it.
Yes, yes. And so let's talk about mental health as well.
Sure.
Because if I think people focus more on the physical well being, but I think the mental health is equally important.
Yep. Agreed.
So let's get into high throughput screening. So tell me, Shravan, what is basically high throughput screening and what about it interests you the most?
It's a very difficult question to answer straight away because high throughput screening is not a technique. It's
Okay.
it's a process. It basically takes any technique that you use, whether it is a radioligand binding assay, a calcium influx assay, or an enzyme activity assay, any of these assays that you usually use to screen your compounds, let's say in a 96-well plate or one compound at a time, right? And then convert this into a more rapid and robust process. So, high throughput screening, as the name sounds, is basically screening a large library of compounds, making it a very high throughput. Uh, so, automating these processes is what high throughput screening does. So, at my previous job, uh, we screened a library of 400,000 compounds in a matter of 2 to 3 weeks using this high
Okay.
throughput screening setup. And if you read, and since my company was more of a smaller biotech, our library size is limited to 400,000. But if you go to larger pharma like Pfizer, AstraZeneca, I was reading a paper from AstraZeneca the other day, and their internal library size is 1.3 million compounds.
Oh, I thought 400,000 is huge.
Yeah, so yeah, 400,000 is probably not even a quarter of 1.3 million.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
um, yeah, so yes, so it's basically, as you know, drug discovery is a very time-taking process, right?
Yes.
And depending on the protein or the target or the receptor you want to hit, right, whether you're finding an inhibitor or a activator, agonist or an antagonist, you usually need a starting point, right, of how to design your compound, of how to hit this target. And in most of the cases there's no starting point, right? And even most of the successful cases from earlier days are mostly found through serendipity. uh, right, you cannot just look at the receptor and say, all right, this is a binding pocket, I think this will fit the best there. It is
Correct.
not possible, right? So you
Yeah.
need a starting point, and there are multiple ways to find these starting points, and high throughput screening is one of the most widely used uh, technique. It's That is something I like about it because you are starting with the unknown. You're screening tons and tons of compounds, and you'll hopefully find a hit that is very specific to your target. So you are the starting point, and that's what I like about it. I am initiating something. I'm initiating the process of drug discovery for this target, and I get this sense of ownership in uh, starting something, and that's what excites me.
Okay, awesome. Yeah, and I think with high throughput screening, the it also makes the process a lot faster as compared to, like you mentioned, you just look at the receptor target and then decide what fits there. So it's like generating a hit or a lead compound there. So can you just quickly go through the process, like what is involved in high throughput screening?
Sure. So the first thing for high throughput screening is, obviously, depending on the project, I am assuming that you already have a target, right? You need to
Okay.
know what protein, what GPCR, what enzyme you're targeting, right? And that is how you have a program or a pipeline if it's a company, right? You have, let's say, uh, a company working on trying to target KRAS, which is an oncology target, right? So you already know that, all right, I want to work with KRAS, right? So you need to have that protein made in huge amounts, right? And for that, you have protein scientists. You can make that protein in different ways. So expressing and purifying the protein would probably the first part if you're doing a purified system-based high-throughput screening. Or if you want to do a screening in cellular systems, you need to know what type of cell is a good cell type to test the indication you want to test, right? So having that starting point is important. And second thing would be to validate that starting point. Let's say you're working with this KRAS I mentioned about. Are you really sure that this KRAS is responsible for cancer? Is it in some way a validated target, right? And that's very important. Why? Because you don't want to spend years or months in a high throughput screening campaign, and it requires thousands of dollars, right? And so many people's time, so many scientists go into it, and then find out that inhibiting KRAS actually does not do anything in cancer settings, right? So it is
Correct.
very important to validate the target. And the third thing, and I think is what I really like the best about high throughput screening, is to develop a screening assay, right? You want to develop an assay that captures what this protein or the target does. You need to have a method of testing the activity of this target or the function of this target. And this is usually called assay development. This process is called assay development, and it is very important that the assay you develop is physiologically relevant. And
Correct.
the reason why it is important is because you might be able to test the activity of this function of this protein in multiple different ways, but eventually what your assay is reading is the function of this protein, right, or the binding of this protein to the compound. If that does not correlate to cellular settings and in vivo settings, all your high throughput screening campaign is not useful. The You want the hits from the high throughput screening campaign to eventually correlate to the cellular settings or the in vivo settings, right? So having a really good screening assay is important. And the next step would be optimizing these assay for a high throughput screening format. And what I mean by that is that when you're usually developing an assay, whether in an academic lab or an industry, you develop it in a 96 well plate, right?
Correct.
And the volumes in 96 well plates are typically above 50 microliters, usually 100 microliters, right? And that consumes a lot of reagents.
Yes.
And when you're testing, let's say with AstraZeneca, 1.3 million compounds, that's a lot of reagents, right? And
Yes.
some of the assays we use, the kits we get is a reagent for detection. This is one other assay I was doing the other day. A kit which can be used for 10 plates, just 10 plates uh, um, of 384 well plate, costs about 13,000,
Oh my goodness.
right? And if you're doing 1.3 million compounds, it just adds up real quick.
Yeah.
And especially if you're doing it in 96 well plate, that's just not feasible, right? So you want to miniaturize this assay as much as possible. So people tend to do either 384 well plate, or in most companies nowadays are trying to do it to 1536 well plates, right? So
You said 1536.
that is right.
I think the biggest well plate I have ever used is like 96. So I'm just imagining what does 1536 looks like.
Yeah, you cannot actually see through it. Like you can see through it, but it's like very sweet. Like
So do you like manually do it, or do you
no,
have a
it's
system?
all. But for 384, you can manually do it. I wouldn't recommend it if you're doing more plates. If it's one plate, maybe you can do it. But 1536, I haven't seen anyone manually use it.
Yes.
It's all automated,
Yeah.
and
Okay.
that's going to be the latest step of the high throughput screening cascade process, right? So yeah, so people spend a good amount of time transferring this 96 well assay to 384 or 1536 well format based on the resources they have, right? And the bigger number of wells you go, the smaller your assay volume would be. Because
Yes.
if you look at it, the 96 well plate size is the same as that of 1536 well plate size. So the
Oh, okay.
plates dimensions are the same, just that the well
The
dimensions become
volume.
smaller and smaller, so the volume becomes smaller and smaller, right? And in 1536, you probably only use like 4 to 5 microliters in assay volume, coming from
Okay.
100 microliters in 96. So you reduce your cost of you reduce all your reagent cost, right? Um, so optimizing this is also important because sometimes scaling down is not easy.
Yes.
You kind of lose your signal assay window, all of that. And once that is optimized, uh, the you have your system ready. And then this other part of high-throughput screening begins, which involves compound libraries, right? As I mentioned, different companies have different sets of compound libraries, and some companies don't have their own compound libraries if they're smaller companies or recent biotechs. And for that reason, we have multiple CROs who have millions of compound libraries that you can actually even transfer your assay to their CRO, and they are going to screen the library for you and give you the data.
Okay, so even that step is taken care of.
Even
Like
that.
that was my next question. Like, if you have like million of compounds or like the library from a CRO, how do you pick which library to go for?
Exactly, right? So the thing with high throughput screening is we don't know what we're looking for, right?
Yes.
We don't know the compound structure, and the larger number of compounds you screen, the better chances of finding a hit, right? It is usually a needle in the haystack,
Yeah.
and the more haystacks you screen, the more needles you find, right?
Yes.
So yes, so we have these what they're called as assay ready plates. That is, these plates already come with pre-dispensed compounds.
Wow.
So you have this plate with compounds in it, and then they're sealed. All you do is open the seal, uh, and then transfer your reagents to it. And it's
Oh
so
my God.
cool that we have this at our company. We have this high-res system. It's from this company called High Resolutions, which integrates everything. That is, it takes the assay-ready plate from the incubator. There's a robotic arm which takes it from the incubator, opens the seal, puts it in a liquid handler which dispenses your reagents, and then from there it does all the let's say you want to incubate it at 27 degrees Celsius. It puts it in an incubator which is at 27 degrees Celsius. After the certain time, wherever you want to do it, it takes it out. If you want to wash the plate, it washes the plate, right? And then adds whatever you want to add it next, and then reset, and then gives you the data. And this is really useful one for multiple reasons, because of this integrated automatic robotic system, you are constantly working the system. A scientist can probably do 20, 30 plates a day, right? Because you'll dispense it at one instrument, you're gonna walk to the second instrument, read it, incubate it at third instrument. You have to takes a lot of manpower into it. But a
Yes.
robot integrates everything in one area. The robotic arm kind of moves it from one machine to another machine, and it can run 24/7.
I am so jealous you have a robotic arm to even like open the seal of a plate.
Yes,
Oh my
it
goodness.
opens the
Just
seal and seals it back, which is so cool and satisfying to watch.
oh my God, like that's what like the other day I was just doing these BCA assays for my Western blot and I'm like 96 well plate, but I'm like, this is tiring. And of course, we don't have a robotic arm, so I do manual additions to all the wells. And at times I was like, did I add to this well? Like it's
Exactly,
just
right?
so confusing.
Especially, and as the number of plates increase, the chances of error also increase, right? And especially, and with the volumes decreasing, there's no way to actually
Yes,
see and say whether you added this 2 microliter reagent or not,
correct.
right? And with a robotic system, you don't have any of those problems as long
Yeah.
as your program is set up right. And
Yeah, I
these
think
days, we have a very user-friendly system to even set up those programs.
yeah.
You don't even have to know programming.
Yeah, like I remember my PhD advisor would say, like, when it comes down to a human and a machine, the machine is always right.
Well, he's probably right. Hope they don't take over the world, but
Yeah, yeah, that's the hope.
uh, yeah. So yeah, so it just speeds up the process, right?
Yes.
And then you get this data, which again is, for me, I screened 400,000 compounds, which was probably like 800 384 well plates, right? And that gives you so much data, right? There is no way you can look at individual compound and say, okay, this compound is doing bad, this compound is good. You need data analysis packages which look at multiple sets at a single time, and there are multiple of such packages which are evolving every day, but then kind of give you with what we call as hits. Hits are compounds which do what you would want for a drug to do, right?
Okay.
And then that is your starting point for your drug discovery campaign. So high-throughput screening, kind of the whole process, gives you a starting point to start with.
Okay, so just I know it would be different for all the libraries. So, for example, you're screening these 400,000 compounds. How much of the compounds do you think would actually be hits?
That is a great question, right? The usual hit rate is in a screening campaign. At least in my experience, I've seen a couple of projects I worked on, a couple of projects my colleagues worked on. It's usually around 0.5%,
Wow.
right? So if you're screening 400,000 compounds, that would be how much? Uh,
Where's the calculator?
that's like 2,000 compounds approximately,
That's still huge.
right? That's still a lot of compounds. So then you have to sit down with these 2,000 compounds and then understand whether these 2,000 compounds are actual hits or they are what we
Like
call
false positives.
false positives, right?
Okay.
Exactly. And even if they're not false positives, they could be doing something else, right? And there's this class of compounds called paints, which if you have, which we have heard of
Yeah.
in our classes with Dr. Glenn.
Yeah.
He used to talk about them. It's these compounds which show up in almost every screen, right? Uh, so you have to be careful about these compounds, right? You need to have a good eye to look at them, or an experienced chemist to point out that okay, this compound has appeared in multiple screening campaigns. It's probably not a good starting point for us to start with. You don't want to go with that compound and end up doing all your exploratory studies because um, again, it will go nowhere.
So, is there also a library for paints?
There are multiple resources to look for paint compounds, and of course, as with many of these data, some of them is publicly available, and many
Okay.
big pharma have their own libraries because as you test more uh, screens, as you have a bigger pipeline, that is, you're testing multiple targets, you start building up your own libraries inside your own data
Yeah.
packages, right? So there are some publicly available pain libraries, and some come with experience, and some come with the privilege of working in big pharma, I guess. Yeah,
Okay. So now that you have 2,000 hits, probably I would say 1,500 because 500 are paints.
sure.
What is the next step?
The next step. So high-throughput screening is usually done at a single concentration. That is, you're testing the ability of this compound, let's say at 10 micromolar, to inhibit this target, right? So that is just whether or not at 10 micromolar this compound inhibits this target. The next step would be to confirm the screening because you're doing 1 point screen, right? And as you know, we usually want it in replicates, right?
Yes.
To believe in your data, right? So there are multiple counter screens depending on the system. The thing from here is there's no set path. Every person, every company can do it in different ways, right? You can do what we call a dose response screen, right? So now you have like a 8 point or 11 point dose response instead of a single point, right? And then you understand from that you get a EC50 or an IC50 value, right? And one way of looking at this data is that all right, I want compounds with the best IC50s, right? You kind of reduce them, and the other way is looking at counter screening. Let's say you have a very similar target which you don't want to hit based on the homology of these two proteins. I want to hit protein A but not protein B, so you would count screen all your hits with protein B, and anything that is hitting both protein A and protein B would be in the trash,
Yes.
right? Then you'll further bring down your compounds to a little bit less.
So, like you mean you want to make selective compounds for
Selective
that one
compound.
particular target?
Exactly. Right. And then you would also do a few counter screens, which are usually well established within each company. Right. We have a assay set up to find aggregators. Right. Small molecules, especially because of their very hydrophobic nature, tend to like form this aggregate, right, in a
Correct. Yep.
buffering system. We don't, and the assay's readout can be influenced when they're forming these aggregates. So we don't want to work with those aggregating compounds, and there's a way to figure out whether these compounds are aggregating or not. So you do those assays, and then weed out those compounds also. And depending on the assay your compounds library you're working with and the protein you're working with, you have multiple other counter screens. Like you have a counter screen to find out redox compounds if you don't want redox compounds in your assay, right? And then you'll eventually go down to like 400 or 300 compounds or something. So you bring it down, bring it down to a comfortable point where you think, all right, I can now look at each and individual structure and then put them into compound classes, right? Because let's say we have 400 final hits. All these 400 compounds are not going to be individual compounds, they're going to be analogs, right?
Correct.
Right? So you would put them into chemical classes. And most of all of this is work done by chemists. So high-throughput screening kind of involves multiple different people from different backgrounds. We have protein scientists to make proteins. We have a biochemist or a biophysicist to make these assays, assay development, right? And then you have automation scientists to automate this entire process in this high-res system, for example. And then you have chemists coming in to look at your data.
So you have jobs for everyone.
We have jobs for everyone. That is right. uh, yeah. So then chemists would come and put them into different classes, and then they'd be like, "All right, this class of compound is very difficult to work with." And then if you look at the analog data, all of them seem to have pretty similar IC50s. So the SAR is pretty flat. We'll not be able to work with it. Let's just put them on the shelf, right? And then the second class, these are all very fatty. They have like 10 alkyl groups on them. Not probably good compounds to work with. Put them
Yeah.
aside, right? So you'd probably end up with like 3 or 4 families that you're comfortable working with. And then the chemist would do all the SAR explanation around them, doing the hit read optimization.
That is another topic for
That
another
for
episode.
another day, yes. So
Yeah.
that is what a high throughput screening campaign involves, all the way from deciding your target to finding a hit.
So from 400,000, you kind of bring it down to 2 or 3 classes of compounds.
That is right.
So how long does this process usually take
It depends, right? It depends
on the
on
assay development and all the steps?
exactly. It depends on multiple different things. Let's say you have your protein, your assay, everything ready, and we're only talking about the screening, right? Because high throughput screening kind of puts screening at the center stage. So if you're only screening what 400,000 compounds, for example, it would take, if everything is automated, uh, about 3 to 4 weeks.
Okay.
Yeah, and
That's
probably even less. But in my
just being conservative.
yeah,
That's not a bad timeline, I
yeah,
think.
yeah, and if you're doing it by hand, you'll probably only screen
Ah,
400 compounds by then. So
definitely.
yeah.
Yeah, like I know you, like by the sound of it, it looks like you love high throughput screening. But let me play the devil's advocate here and ask you, what do you don't like about it? Is there anything you don't like about it?
Um I enjoy the asset development portion the most
Okay.
because that is very thrilling to me in terms of developing something, trying to understand the biology, and then bring it to in vitro system. You want, as I said, your assay should correlate the physiological setting as much as possible, right? That takes into account a lot of you are more putting in your brains into asset development. And for me, high throughput screening, once automated, does not involve any of your own energy in it, right?
Brains. Yeah.
Exactly. You don't need to put in brain for that. Once it's automated, right?
Yeah.
Trying to give as much um, appreciation to the automation process. It can't be. It's not easy, and uh, we need persons with the skill set, right, to do that, and that is very interesting as well. But the robot doing its thing is
Yeah.
really nice to watch it for one day, but after that, it's
Yeah.
pretty boring, you know?
Yeah, but I think if you think about it, it's like the necessary evil.
Yep,
Like you need the robots to screen through such huge
exactly.
libraries,
Right.
and also, like you don't have like the human errors. Like you
Exactly.
mentioned about pipetting like 2 microliters into each well, like we can't even see that.
Yep.
So I think it's like necessary at this
Exactly.
point.
Agreed, right? And if I had to pick between doing it manually or automating it, I would do it automate any day. But that can be a little bit boring for scientists sometimes, right? I would say that's not a downside, but that's how the system works, right? But what I don't like about it on a more serious note is that uh, we are exhausting our compound libraries, right? We are screening, like, if you look at the trends in terms of high throughput screening, in the initial days, let's say 1900, 1990s, all of those, a screening campaign gave more hits, which actually reached the clinic, compared to screening campaigns these days. Because we are screening the same libraries with a different target. So we are exhausting our libraries, right? And um, there's not so much unique in terms of
Compounds out
chemical
there.
libraries coming every day. So the success rate is going down from high throughput screening. That being said, it's not impossible, right? People are still doing high throughput screening on a daily basis. People are finding so many hits on a daily basis, which are reached in the clinic. But the success rate is going down in part because of lack of novelty in high throughput screen in the screening libraries, because screening libraries, as I just mentioned, you need millions of compounds. So what happens is that you have, let's say, a benzene or something, right? You make minor modifications to it, to an existing compound, to make a different compound and increase your library size. But are there very big variations in scaffold, in the complexity, is the fused ring, all of those, I think those reduce. um, that's one thing. And the second downside is sometimes it's very difficult not to realize that you're dealing with, or you're working with, a false positive, let me say it, right?
Those pains.
Yeah, they might or might not be pain, but
Okay.
or it might not be a false positive also. But sometimes it's, you realize you're spending a few years before knowing that, okay, this is not doing what I think it should do.
Okay.
And that's a story more common than you would think also, right?
Correct.
So you have to be very careful about working with this compound sometimes.
Okay. So, in terms of, I know like you covered what you guys do in the industry, but what does high throughput screening looks in academic settings? Because I'm pretty sure no lab is spending $13,000 on a kit to do like just 10 kits out there. And obviously, I have not seen a robotic arm in any labs yet.
So, high throughput screening is a very, what do you mean by high, right? Is 400,000 high? Is 1.3 million high, right? So, that level of high ranges from every place, and it depends on where you are, right? Um, I would say academia, a regular academia, mostly does what I like to call medium throughput screening. Uh, their compound libraries are usually less than 10,000 or so,
Okay.
right? And in a more conservative setting like VCU, where we have been, the compound libraries are more in less than 1,000 compounds, right? But it is, people are building up libraries, people are purchasing libraries from external sources, and people are trying to um, you know, do as much high-throughput screening as possible. Um, like I can just give, based on my own experience at VCU, that you don't necessarily need a robotic arm to screen, let's say, 5,000 compounds, right? It's a few 384 well plates, or even if you're doing in 96 well plates for 5,000 compounds, you might probably be able to do it just fine, right? And um, people do get good data out of it, good results out of it, good compounds that can be translated into the um, animal models. I'm not sure if how successful academic labs have been to translate into the clinic. And there are many success stories. I don't want to say no. And for example, I can tell you about my experience at Scripps as a postdoc. And yes, we had a unit within Scripps where they house a lot of chemical libraries, and they used to bring in these chemical libraries. And I'm pretty sure, I might be wrong, but their chemical libraries are in the 5 to 6 figure compounds, so close to 100,000 compounds, are probably more, right? So academic, I wouldn't say academic labs, but academic institutions or academic hubs, right? Like in San Diego, we have Scripps, Salk, UCSD, Stanford, Burnham, like a couple of different institutions which pool their resources and form this collaborative academic union where they can house in libraries from different vendors, different sources, and like what Dr. Desai was trying to initially do at VCU, build a screening facility for ISB 3D, right? Institute of Structural Biology, Drug Design, and Development. So more and more academic universities are doing that. Whether an academic lab by itself can do it, it just depends on the funding available and how important that screening campaign is to that project. But and in terms of the second question of whether academic labs can afford a $13,000 worth of kit, uh, well, that's a good question, and even for industry, it can be difficult sometimes, right? With a lot of funding, there's ways around, right? Um, so to screen one particular target, there are multiple different assays that you can develop, right? The assay I was talking about probably gives you a better assay window, is more robust and everything, right? But then it's also very costly. But then there are nine other different assays which are less expensive, but you might have to compromise on your assay window a little bit, or you might have to be, it's less robust or something like that, right? So academic labs can find these different solutions to it.
So
Yeah,
there are like ways for everyone to do high throughput screening.
exactly. It doesn't have to be a robot.
And
You can
yeah,
just,
and as you mentioned, I think collaboration is key. Like I think more institute come together, I think there are better chances to like have this screening facilities, and everyone benefits from it
exactly, right? Yep. This to the for the greater good anyway.
for the greater good of science
Mm-hmm.
and for humanity
For humanity.
eventually.
That's why we are all in it.
Yes, yeah, that's the goal.
Yep.
So, like as you mentioned, I know we diverted a little. Like when you have those, like you have screened and eliminated like most of the compounds, you come down to those two or three classes of compounds. If I'm not mistaken, they are called leads, right?
Well, they are still hits.
Okay.
They are just classified into different families, uh, and then you would work on those families of hits to slowly change them to a lead compound. A lead compound is something that would be ready to put in an animal.
Okay.
Uh,
So
Again,
like ready for a preclinical phase.
exactly. With the hit, so the hit to lead optimization would be starting from those families to going to maybe one or two lead compounds. You don't usually have more than those lead compounds, right? Um, and in this process, you'll be testing it in different models. Yeah, like you'll probably go away from a purified system, and you'll probably test it in different cells, different cell lines, different biophysical states, right? And different like analyzing them in different contexts, like not just a phenotypic cell screen, but also endpoint based cellular screen. that, and then looking at your selectivity and specificity, and also is this compound developable in terms of ADME properties, right? You might not necessarily test it in an animal in terms of ADME, but you have theoretical models and predictors of ADME properties. So all of these are taken into consideration in your hit to lead development, and also a couple of things like does this seeds affect compounds, do they affect important activities, like do they block the potassium channel in the heart, right? Or do they have any effects on the serotonin receptor? All of these, a few well established markers which you don't want to hit necessarily are usually tested to make sure that you're not hitting them in terms of safety.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So, like, I think from what we have learned today, it's like taking this huge library and cutting it down to like what, one or two compounds.
That is right.
And from all the stories going on, there are again chances that might not work in the future.
Right, right. So starting off with your high throughput screen, doing to the lead compound, it might take 1 or 2 years or even more, depending on the success rate. And once you put it in an animal, right, that is when you would know if it's working or not, right? And when I mentioned that a lot of times it's too late to realize, like it's just you spend so much time. That's what I meant, because your cellular hits or your hits from all of these screens don't necessarily translate in vivo, and you have to go back and see, okay, maybe this was wrong, and it's just very disappointing then.
So it is like a continuous process.
It is.
So, for example, if you end up in this scenario, like it did not work, would you like again go back and screen a new library for the same target?
That's a really good question. It depends, right? It depends on a lot of different situations, financial situation being one, right? Whether the company uh, thinks it's a good target to pursue, whether uh, and where when you go back and analyze your screen and your data, and you realize maybe your entire process was good, just that your lead optimization probably was not right. You know, if that's the case, you'll probably like just change one of your leads and then test it in a different model. And sometimes it is possible that the animal model you're testing itself is wrong,
Okay.
right? So you might just change the animal model, right? And sometimes you realize that everything was right, it's just that protein is difficult to hit, and then you might not want to pursue that. So it's very situation based and finance based and necessity based.
Yeah, wow. So I think just reaching to that one lead compound takes a couple of years, and then you can like we all know, like from preclinical to getting it approved is like whole another battle
That
which
is right.
people
Yeah.
face, and I think definitely we should cover that in the future.
And as
But
someone working with animals, you should probably know animal
oh
work
my
takes a
god,
lot of
like
time.
tell me about it, like the experiments which I'm like working on, the animal behavior, like the animals are so finicky, like just today they will be like, okay, they will perform the experiment 100%, I'm happy, and tomorrow they're like, nope, I'm not going to do it, and I'm like, and what do I do, that is one thing I used to love about chemistry, because when I make a compound, I have things like NMR, mass spec, and I can proudly say, yes, I'm 100% sure that I have made this compound. But with animal research, it's always in the gray area, so that is something I definitely miss about chemistry.
Yes, yes. You are dictated by how their status is, and not
Yes,
whether you are ready to
exactly.
do the experiment. It just depends on whether the cells are ready or the animals are ready, right? Yep.
Yeah. Well, I think this was a very fun episode. Thank you so much, Shravan, for all the insight. And please let me know if you have some reading material for our listeners. I will make sure and put it down in the description. And once again, thank you so much, Shravan, for being here.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Barka, for inviting me. It has been a real pleasure catching up, and I wish you all the success with your podcast.
Thank you so much, Shravan. And listeners, I will catch you next week on another fun episodes. And remember, it's not a bad thing to be a nerd. Bye.